Amina had always been the kind of nurse who listened more than she spoke. In the small hospital where she worked, her gentle hands and kind eyes made her patients feel safe. The hospital itself was not big or modern. The paint on the walls had begun to fade, and the air often carried the mixed scent of medicine and old wood. Still, for the people in town, it was the place where hope lived, and Amina was a big part of that hope. One evening, after a long day of helping patients, she walked into one of the quieter wards. There were only a few patients there, resting under dim lights. Her steps were soft as she moved from bed to bed, checking on each one. That was when she stopped at the bed of an elderly man named Kweku. He had been in the hospital for some weeks now, and though his body was weak, his eyes were still sharp and filled with life. Kweku looked at Amina as though he had been waiting for her. His voice, though tired and low, carried an unusual weight. "Amina," he said, "please sit with me. I have something I must tell you." Amina was surprised. Usually, Kweku spoke only about small things, his meals, the weather, or the pain in his chest. But this time his voice held something different. She pulled a chair closer and sat by his side, her hands folded in her lap. "I am here, Baba Kweku," she said gently. "Tell me what troubles you." For a moment, Kweku closed his eyes as though gathering the strength to speak. The sound of the ticking clock filled the silence between them. Then he opened his eyes again and looked straight at Amina. "This is not only about my health," he whispered. "This is about something I have carried for many years. Something I cannot take with me to the grave." Amina felt her heart grow heavy. She had seen many patients share regrets or secrets before their last days, but there was something different about Kweku's tone. His eyes seemed to hold more than just sorrow, they carried the weight of history itself. "What is it?" she asked softly, leaning closer. Kweku's lips trembled, but his voice was steady. "I want to see the ocean one last time. That has been my wish for many years. I was born near the sea, and I remember the sound of the waves, the salt in the air, and the endless blue stretching before me. But it has been decades since I last stood by the shore. Before my time ends, I want to see it again, even if only once." Amina nodded, her eyes soft with compassion. "That is a beautiful wish, Baba. The sea is far, but maybe we can find a way. I will speak to the doctor and see what can be done." Kweku smiled faintly, but then his smile faded, and his gaze grew serious. "The ocean is not my only wish," he continued. "There is also a truth I must speak before I leave this world. A truth I have buried for many years. A truth that some would prefer to stay hidden." Amina felt the air around her change. It was as though the walls of the small hospital room were closing in. She could hear her own heartbeat, quick and uneasy. "What truth is this, Baba?" she asked carefully. Kweku sighed deeply, his chest rising and falling with effort. "When I was younger, I saw something. Something powerful men did not want anyone to know. I stayed silent out of fear. I built a life, raised children, and grew old. But the silence has weighed on me more heavily than any illness. Now that my days are numbered, I cannot take this silence with me. I must tell it to someone I trust, and that someone is you." Amina swallowed hard. She was only a nurse, yet here she was, being trusted with something that seemed larger than herself. She thought of how many times she had promised patients she would listen no matter what. Now she had to keep that promise more than ever. She took his frail hand gently into hers. "You can trust me, Baba. Whatever you say, I will listen, and I will keep your words safe." Kweku studied her face for a moment, his tired eyes searching for any sign of doubt. But Amina's face was calm and honest as always. He nodded slowly. "Good. You are brave and you have a pure heart. That is why I chose you. You must promise me, Amina, when I am gone, you will not let my story die with me." The nurse's chest tightened. She had no idea what he was about to share, but she could feel its importance. Still she gave a firm nod. "I promise, Baba." For a while neither of them spoke. The night sounds of the hospital drifted into the room, the shuffle of feet in the hallway, the distant clatter of metal trays, the low murmur of another nurse speaking to a patient. But inside that small room, the silence between Amina and Kweku felt heavy, filled with something unspoken but very real. At last Kweku closed his eyes again. His breathing was slow but steady. "Not tonight," he said in a whisper. "Tonight, I only needed to know that someone is ready to hear me. My strength is not enough to tell it all now. But soon I will speak, and when I do, you must be ready." Amina gave his hand a small squeeze. "I will be ready," she said. "Rest now. Tomorrow we can talk more." Kweku opened his eyes one last time and gave her a small, tired smile. "Thank you, child. You do not know how much you have given me tonight. When Amina finally left his bedside, she felt as though she had been carrying not only his care but also his past, his fears and his hope. She walked down the corridor, her mind racing. What was the truth he carried? What could be so heavy that he had kept it hidden for decades? And why did he choose her out of everyone to hear it? The next evening, Amina returned to Kweku's room with a notebook hidden in her bag. She told no one about what he had shared with her before. She did not want whispers among the staff or curious ears picking up something not meant for them. When she entered, Kweku was sitting upright, his pillow supporting his back. His eyes were heavy with age, but they still carried a fire that had not dimmed. "You came back," he said with a faint smile. "I promised I would," Amina replied gently. She sat by his side again just as she had the night before. "You said you had more to tell me, Baba? I am ready to listen." Kweku was silent for a long moment. The soft hum of the hospital generator filled the air, steady and low. He turned his face toward the window, where the faint outline of trees could be seen against the night sky. "What I am about to tell you is not small," he whispered. "It is something I have carried in my heart for too long. If I die with it, then the truth will die with me." Amina leaned closer, her voice calm. "Then tell me. Your story will not be lost." Kweku closed his eyes briefly as if to steady himself. Then he began. "I was a young man once, strong and full of dreams. I worked in the city where the roads were always busy, and the air smelled of smoke and sweat. It was during those years that I saw something I should not have seen." Amina's heart began to beat faster. She stayed quiet, knowing he needed space to pour out his words. "There was a gathering," Kweku continued slowly. "Important men met in secret, men who held power in their hands like fire. They spoke of things that would change the lives of many, but their hearts were full of greed. They made decisions not for the people but for themselves. And I was there by accident, a young worker who walked into the wrong place at the wrong time." His hands trembled as he spoke. Amina reached out and placed her hand over his, steadying him. "Go on, Baba. I am listening." Kweku nodded. "They thought no one outside that room would ever know. They made plans to take land from families, to hide money meant for schools and hospitals, to silence those who would resist. I heard their voices, I saw their faces, and I remembered their names. That night, I carried the weight of what I had witnessed. But I also carried fear. Those men were powerful and they had eyes everywhere. I told no one, not even my wife. To speak would have been dangerous." He paused, his breathing uneven. The memories seemed to press heavily on his chest. Amina gave him water, and after a few sips, he continued. "The years passed and the lies grew stronger. People suffered while those men grew richer. I lived with the guilt of my silence, watching the world shaped by their greed. Every time I saw a child without food, every time I saw a mother cry because she could not afford medicine, I remembered that room. I remembered the voices, the papers on the table, the laughter of men who thought no one would dare expose them." Amina's throat tightened. She felt as if she had been pulled into Kweku's past, standing in the shadows of that secret meeting. "Do you still remember their names?" she asked softly. Kweku looked at her with eyes sharp as a blade. "I remember every one of them. I wrote them down long ago in case the day came when I found courage. The names, the places, the dates, they are all in my mind. And now I will give them to you." Slowly, he reached under his pillow and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hand shook as he held it out to her. Amina took it carefully, unfolding the fragile sheet. The paper was old, the ink faded, but the words were clear. Names of men, some she recognized, leaders, businessmen, respected figures in society. And beside the names were places, dates, and details of deals made in the shadows. Her eyes widened as she read. This was more than a memory. This was proof. Kweku's voice grew weaker, but his determination burned bright. "I could not speak when I was young. But I will speak through you now. Do not let them bury this truth. Do not let fear silence you." Amina folded the paper again and placed it close to her chest. Her hands trembled, not with weakness but with the weight of what she now carried. She knew that if the wrong people discovered she had this, her life could change in dangerous ways. Yet she also knew this was more than a patient's secret. This was his last wish, his final hope. "Baba," she said firmly, "I will not let your truth die. I promise you that. Whatever risk it brings, I will honor your wish." Kweku looked at her with tears in his eyes. "You are brave, child. More brave than I ever was. My time is short, but I feel lighter now. The burden is no longer mine alone." The room grew quiet again, the silence heavy with meaning. Amina sat by his side, her mind spinning. She thought of the men whose names she had just read. Some were still alive, still powerful, still respected in society. If the truth came out, it could shake the foundations of many lives. But she also thought of Kweku, the frail man before her who had carried this secret in his heart for decades. His face, lined with age and sorrow, now looked softer, almost peaceful. She understood then that this was more than just a story. This was his freedom. As the night deepened, Amina remained by his side, watching him drift into sleep. She could not close her eyes, for the paper in her pocket seemed to burn with every heartbeat. She had promised to help him, and promises were not things she broke. She whispered to herself in the stillness, "This is no longer just his story. It is mine too now." And with that, she knew her life had taken a turn she could never reverse. The next morning, Amina sat in the hospital courtyard with the folded paper hidden inside her notebook. The sun was rising slowly, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Around her, nurses walked to their shifts, carrying files and medicines, their voices low and steady. Yet Amina's heart was far from steady. It beat fast, as if every step she took was heavier than the last. She had not slept well the night before. Kweku's words replayed in her head again and again. The names, the places, the stolen hope of so many people. She knew that what he had shared was not only a story but a dangerous truth. It was a truth powerful men had tried to bury. When she first spoke to her fellow nurses about it, hoping someone would guide her, their reactions surprised her. One of them, Efua, shook her head sharply. "Amina, do not speak of this again," she whispered. "These things are not for us. They belong to the ones above. If you say too much, they will silence you." Another, Kofi, a senior staff member, pulled her aside with concern. "Child, be careful. I know you want to help that old man, but some stories must stay in the grave. You are young. You do not know the danger." Their words made her chest feel heavy. For a moment, doubt wrapped around her like a shadow. Maybe she should forget. Maybe she should burn the paper, walk away, and never look back. But when she returned to Kweku's room, all of her fear and doubt weakened. Kweku was lying in bed, his breathing shallow. His skin looked pale, and his hands trembled as he reached for her. When he saw her, his tired eyes lit up with something soft but desperate. "You came back," he whispered. Amina took his hand gently. "Of course I did. I am here." He looked at her closely, as if trying to read the thoughts in her mind. "You spoke of me, didn't you? You tried to tell others." Amina hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but they said I should not. They warned me. They said it is too dangerous." Kweku's hand tightened weakly around hers. "Do you see, child? This is why I stayed silent for so many years. Fear controls people more than chains. They will rather bury the truth than risk angering the powerful." His voice cracked. "But if you stay silent too, then my life ends with nothing. My truth will die with me." Amina felt her throat tighten. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of a lifetime of secrets pressing down on him. At that moment, she knew she could not betray him with silence. His story was more than just a dying man's burden. It was a light he was asking her to carry into the world. "Baba," she said softly, her voice steady though her hands shook, "I will not let your truth fade. I promise you that." For the first time, Kweku smiled, though it was faint. "Then you are braver than most." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amina worked through her rounds, but her thoughts kept returning to the folded paper. Every time she touched her pocket, she felt its presence burning against her skin. She wanted to share it, but fear lingered. Who could she trust? Who would believe her? At lunch, she tried again with a doctor she respected, Dr. Mensah. She spoke carefully, avoiding too many details, but enough to test his reaction. His face turned dark as soon as she mentioned corruption and hidden truths. "Amina," he said firmly, lowering his voice, "you are young and kind. But this is not your fight. You cannot change what has been broken for so long. If you push too far, you will not only hurt yourself, you will put this hospital and even your family at risk." Her heart sank. Again the warning was the same: stay silent. Leave it buried. That night, she sat alone in her small apartment. The paper lay on her desk, unfolded. The names stared back at her like ghosts, ghosts that wanted justice, ghosts that demanded she act. She thought of her own younger brother, of her neighbors, of children in the community who struggled every day. What if the truth inside this paper could change even a little piece of that suffering? Her eyes filled with tears. She was torn between fear and duty, between silence and courage. In the quiet, she remembered Kweku's face, his eyes filled with plea, his voice trembling with regret. She thought of his words, "If you stay silent too, then my life ends with nothing." Slowly, Amina wiped her tears and folded the paper again. She placed it carefully back in her notebook. Then she whispered aloud into the darkness of her room, "I cannot let his voice die." The next morning she went to the hospital again. The staff greeted her as usual, but she carried herself differently. She walked with quiet determination, as if her steps had found new strength. When she entered Kweku's room, his weak eyes turned toward her. She smiled gently and sat beside him. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "But your truth will not fade. I will find a way. I will make sure your story is heard." Kweku's lips curved into a tired but peaceful smile. A tear slipped from his eye. "Then I can rest." Amina held his hand tighter, her heart steady now. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. She would face disbelief, fear, and maybe even danger. But she also knew she could not abandon him. His last wish had become her mission. And so, in that quiet hospital room, a silent agreement was made. An old man's secret and a young nurse's courage had joined together. It was no longer just Kweku's fight. It was theirs. Amina sat at her desk late into the night, the small lamp casting a warm glow on the notebook before her. The hospital was quiet, and the only sound was the scratching of her pen as she carefully wrote down every word Kweku had spoken. She did not want to miss even the smallest detail. His story was heavy, filled with truths that had been locked away for years. Her hands shook sometimes, but she pressed on. Every name, every place, every moment he described, she wrote it all. She remembered his weak but determined voice, the way he had held her hand, the way his eyes pleaded with her not to let his story die. When she was finished, she stared at the pages. To her they looked more powerful than gold. They were more than ink and paper. They were the voice of a man who had been silenced by fear for most of his life. Now it was her duty to make sure the voice was heard. The next morning, Amina folded the pages and carried them with her. She knew she could not trust everyone. The danger was real. But she also knew that she could not do this alone. She needed others who would believe her, who would protect this truth with her. She thought of her friend Ajoa, a teacher in the town. Ajoa was wise and respected. People often turned to her for advice, and she had the courage to speak when others stayed silent. That evening, Amina visited her and shared the notebook. At first, Ajoa read quietly, her brow furrowed as her eyes moved across the lines. Then she looked up, her face pale. "Amina," she whispered, "do you know what this means?" Amina nodded slowly. "Yes, it is dangerous. But it is also the truth. I promised Kweku I would not let it die." Ajoa sat back, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. After a long pause, she said, "Then we cannot keep this hidden. If one voice is silenced, another must rise. I will help you." With Ajoa's support, Amina began to share the story quietly, carefully, only with people they trusted. They spoke to Kwabena, a local trader who often traveled to nearby towns, and to Efua, a seamstress whose shop was a gathering place for women. Soon the whispers began to grow. At first people listened with doubt. "It cannot be true," some said. "Such things are too dangerous to even speak of." But as more details came out, as the same names and places repeated through different mouths, the doubt turned into curiosity. And curiosity grew into belief. In the hospital, Amina noticed the change. Some staff still warned her to stay silent, but others began to look at her differently. They whispered in the hallways, "She is the one helping Kweku speak." Patients too started asking about the story. It spread like fire on dry grass. For Kweku the change was clear. When Amina entered his room now, he no longer looked only like a sick man waiting for his last breath. He looked like someone whose life had finally found meaning. His voice, once ignored, was now traveling beyond the walls of the hospital. One afternoon, Amina sat beside him and told him softly, "They are listening now. The town knows. People are speaking." Tears filled Kweku's eyes. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Then I am not dying in silence. You gave me my voice back." Those words stayed in Amina's heart. She realized then that sometimes healing was not only for the body. Sometimes it was for the soul, for the heart that had carried too much pain. The whispers in the town grew stronger with each passing day. In the market, people spoke of the young nurse who had listened when no one else dared. At gatherings, they repeated Kweku's words, each retelling carrying more weight than before. The secret that powerful people had once buried was no longer safe in the ground. It had risen, carried by the courage of one dying man and one young woman who refused to be silent. For Amina it was not easy. She felt the fear pressing on her, especially when she noticed strangers watching her in the streets or when warnings came again. "Be careful, girl. You do not know who is listening." But each time fear tried to silence her, she thought of Kweku's eyes, the eyes of a man who had carried truth for a lifetime. She thought of the promise she made and she found strength again. One evening as she walked through the market, an old woman touched her arm. "Child," the woman said, "I heard what you are doing for that man in the hospital. Do not stop. His story matters. It reminds us all that silence can kill but courage can save." Amina smiled softly, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. She realized this was bigger than her, bigger than Kweku, bigger than fear. It was a spark that had the power to light up even the darkest corners. Kweku was no longer just an old man waiting for death. He had become a voice, a lesson, a symbol of truth. And Amina was no longer just a nurse. She had become a bridge between silence and courage. That night as she returned to the hospital and sat by Kweku's side, she whispered, "Your voice is alive. It will not be erased." And Kweku, with weak breath but shining eyes, whispered back, "Then my life was not wasted." The hospital room was quiet, except for the slow rhythm of Kweku's breathing. The evening sun slipped through the small window, painting the walls in soft golden light. Amina sat by his side, her hand gently wrapped around his frail fingers. She had been there for hours, listening to his shallow breaths, knowing that the end was close. Kweku's eyes opened, weak but calm. He turned to Amina with a faint smile. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Thank you, child, you gave me peace." His voice was fragile, but every word carried deep meaning. Amina squeezed his hand, her eyes filling with tears. "You are not alone, Baba," she said softly. "Your truth is alive now. People are listening." A quiet sigh escaped Kweku's lips, and for a moment his gaze lingered on her, full of gratitude. Then, with that final smile still resting on his face, his body stilled. His hand loosened in hers. Kweku had passed away peacefully without fear, knowing his voice would not be forgotten. Amina sat in silence, her heart heavy but strangely calm. She wept, but her tears were not only for sorrow. They were also for the strength he had given her, for the courage she had found through him. She gently closed his eyes and whispered, "Rest now, Baba. Your truth has found the light." News of Kweku's passing spread quickly through the hospital. Some staff lowered their heads in respect, others murmured about the strange story that had grown around him. But everyone knew he had not left this world in silence. He had left with his story alive, thanks to the young nurse who never turned away from him. The following days were filled with whispers in the town. In the market, at the wells, and even in the small schools, people spoke of Kweku's final wish. They remembered the man who had carried a heavy secret for years and the nurse who had carried it out into the world. His name was no longer tied only to illness or age, it was tied to truth, courage, and freedom from fear. Amina walked through the streets quietly, but she could feel the eyes of the people on her. Some would nod in respect, others would stop her to say, "You gave that old man peace. You gave us a story that should not be forgotten." At first, Amina felt shy, but then she realized this was not about her. It was about Kweku and what he had left behind. One evening she visited his small home. The door was worn, the walls simple, but inside she found traces of his life: an old stool, a walking stick, a shelf with faded books. She sat down and let the silence of the place wash over her. She thought of the boy Kweku once was, the young man who had seen something terrible, the elder who carried silence like a burden, and finally the patient who had chosen to trust her with everything. She whispered into the empty room, "Your story is safe with me." As the weeks passed, the whispers in town grew into conversations. Conversations grew into questions. People began to ask why such truths had been hidden for so long. Some were afraid to talk, but others grew bold. Slowly, the buried past began to rise into the open. Kweku's story was no longer just his, it belonged to everyone. Through it all, Amina kept working at the hospital. She still cared for the sick, still comforted the weak, still smiled at the children who came with fevers. But people looked at her differently now. She was no longer just Nurse Amina. She was the one who had honored a dying man's wish. She was the one who had carried his truth from the shadows into the light. One morning, a young boy came to her while she was walking to the market. He looked up at her with wide eyes and asked, "Are you the nurse who helped the old man tell his story?" Amina smiled and nodded. "Yes, I was with him." The boy's face brightened. "My grandmother says you are brave. She says because of you, people are not so afraid to speak anymore." The words touched Amina deeply. She bent down and placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "It is not about me," she said softly. "It is about remembering that truth is stronger than fear." The boy nodded as if he understood more than his young years allowed. Then he ran off calling back, "I will remember his name. Kweku." Hearing the name spoken aloud by a child made Amina's heart swell. She realized then that Kweku's wish had been fulfilled more completely than she had imagined. He had wanted peace, he had wanted to see the ocean, he had wanted the truth spoken. And though his body had grown weak, his voice now traveled further than the waves of the sea he longed for. Years later, people still remembered. In gatherings, elders spoke of Kweku and how he had finally found the courage to share what he knew. And always, alongside his story, was Amina's name, the nurse who had listened, who had honored him, who had chosen courage over silence. Amina never sought fame or reward. To her, it was simple. She had made a promise to a man in his final hours, and she had kept it. That was her duty not only as a nurse but as a human being. She had healed not just his body but his spirit. She had shown that sometimes the greatest healing came not from medicine but from compassion, from listening, from courage. Standing by the shore one day, looking at the vast ocean that Kweku had wished to see, Amina let the wind brush against her face. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I brought your truth here, Baba. The waves will carry it further than we ever could." And as the waves rolled endlessly, Amina felt at peace just as Kweku had. The people remembered both his courage and her kindness. In the end, she was not only known as a nurse. She was remembered as the woman who had fulfilled a man's final wish and carried his buried truth into the light. The story lived on. And with it, so did they. The end.